Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on the Colorado Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready codes for residential buildings. This webinar is recorded and the recordings are posted to the Code Adoption Toolkit, which I'll send a link in the chat shortly. If there are any issues with audio between Hope or I, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello, and I'm a project manager for Noresco, where we work with the Colorado Energy Office to put on trainings like this one. And this training is sponsored by Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Shums Coda Associates. As you see, we've got a few more on the list here, and we'll be adding to this as well. But we've got today's webinar, and then starting off hot in the new year with the IRC Chapter 11 on the 3rd. So we hope to see you at some of these other ones coming up as well. And keep an eye out for me on other editions as well. But we are always offering tailored group training. So if you're interested in setting up a training for your jurisdiction or your company, feel free to reach out to me. You guys probably have my email from the outreach that we do for these webinars and trainings. So I'm just a quick message away. And so most of you probably know about the Code Adoption Toolkit. We've got a whole bunch of resources and tools in there. We're looking at revamping the Code Adoption Toolkit as well. So you'll probably see some changes to it in the next few months or so. But all of these recordings are posted onto this website as well. So definitely check those out. But there is the helpline, the Colorado Codes helpline, which kicked off about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years at this point. But it's for anyone in the state that has a question on any of the I codes, or jurisdiction amendments, reach codes. If you have a question about a plan review item or an inspection item, reach out. Or if you're just, a homeowner looking for how to work through this compliance process, how to make upgrades to your home, we're here to help. So don't hesitate to reach out and submit a question on there, and you can scan that QR code or go to that hyperlink there. I'm going to take you right to it. So enough of the housekeeping items. Well, I guess I got a couple more things for you guys. Throughout the webinar, we want to encourage questions. So please use that Q&A function, and I will let Hope know throughout the presentation so that, any topic that's on the screen, she can address any questions immediately. There's also the ability to raise your hand and ask us a question directly, so I can unmute you. Please do that as well. We're flexible here. And then, of course, last but not least, there is a survey window that will pop up at the end of the presentation. And so if you could please take a minute to provide feedback, that would be extremely helpful in continuing to improve on these webinars, continuing to present on topics that you guys are interested in. And yeah, so today's presenter is Hope Medina, and Hope's is a energy and sustainability consultant for Shums Coda Associates. She's worked on a national level and a local level to assist folks with adopting the energy and green codes. She's a governing member of the ICC Sustainability Membership Council, a consensus committee member, and task group chair of the National Green Building Standard for several code cycles now. So we are in good hands today. And I want to thank you, Hope, for taking the time to present to us. So with that, I'll let you take it from here, and I will be lobbing questions to you throughout today's presentation.
Sounds good. All right, so everyone, we're going to have a little bit of fun taking a look at the residential provisions for the Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready codes. Now, you may or may not be aware that these came about because of House Bill 22-1362, which had some parameters envisioned with that, such as, if you've adopted a code, you need to enforce the energy code. And then when you adopt a new code, you are required now to adopt what is being called the Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready provisions. And the idea for this really came about because there was concepts of how can we best future-proof our construction to kind of what many goals within the state were and what the state goals are looking at. And quite honestly, it's not that far off from uh, other states that are looking at some of this. So if you are interested, you can go on to the state's website, and they have a few items in there that are incredibly helpful. One is the actual language that we're going to talk about today. And then they also have a second version of it that adds little like notes to it that'll say this is talking about XYZ. So it's almost a user manual, but not quite a user manual. So this is the location to get all of that information. If I had the thought about it, I would have popped it into the chat so that if you wanted to follow along, you could follow along with it. So I know that a lot of times when we start talking about new codes or new concepts, there's always that a little bit of fear, right? It's the fear of the unknown. What are we looking at? What now do we have to try to figure out? And the really nice thing about the newly appointed, and I don't know if I could call it newly anymore, but the recent appointed Colorado Energy Code Board is while they were charged with developing the language that would go into these requirements, they understood that the majority of the jurisdictions and communities here within Colorado adopt and follow the I code. So what they did is they designed this particular language to follow those same type of basic concepts that we're familiar with, such as we know that if we open up any of the books on that screen, if we look at chapter 1, we're going to find admin provisions, right? When does this apply? How does this apply? All those fun things. We also know that if we look at chapter 2 always contains definitions for us. And so it's not any different in this particular code. And then the remaining chapters are based off of what the concepts that the state bill does require. So I hope there's a little less fear about all of that. And I'll be quite honest with you, I got to sit in those meetings, and I think they really did take to heart a lot of understanding, you know, the perspective of everybody that's involved with this, because this is an end user concept, right? It's not just code officials, it's not just architects, it's not just contractors, it's all of the end users figuring out how to incorporate these new concepts into an already existing design. So we're going to walk through this particular code when it pertains to the residential provisions. And we're going to kind of walk through it, and I'm going to have an awful lot of code language on the screen. And the reason I'm keeping a lot of the code language intact and not bullet pointing it is because I want to make sure that everybody is very aware of what the actual verbiage is within this new code. So then we can start working from there. So the first thing is, as you can see, is really dealing with what the scoping and the admin part of it. It tells us what the intent is, right? The intent is we're trying to regulate the design and constructions and prepare new buildings for solar photovoltaic, solar thermal, electric vehicle charging, and electrification of the building systems. We know that the applicability of this is when there are different code sections and very specific materials and methods or requirements, the most restrictive shall govern. Now, when there happens to be a conflict, because sometimes there are conflicts, between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement will take precedence over here. And then the really interesting thing is the two items at the bottom of the screen tells us that residential buildings have to comply with the residential chapters of this code, and the commercial buildings need to comply with the commercial provisions of this code. And I think that that's very important, because I'm going to ask you, as far as the energy code goes, how does the energy code define what is a residential building? Raise your hand, put it in the chat. However, anybody who wants to be brave to answer the question. I'll give you a second and see if anybody's going to be brave. Okay. So out of the energy code, residential buildings are considered to be the single family, 2-family, and townhouses, but it also includes R2s, R3s, and R4s that are 3 stories or less above grade. And then commercial buildings are any building that doesn't fall under the residential provisions. Now, that is a semi-complex concept of what's considered to be residential and commercial. Now, the board took that to heart. And so what they did was, for this code, it defined a residential building as those 1- and 2-family dwellings and townhouses as they happen to be defined out of the IRC. And then they quantified that a commercial building, just for this particular code, happens to be all commercial buildings and our occupancies that are covered by the IBC. So this code is kind of broken up into more of, if you build it out of the IRC, you follow the residential provisions. Whereas if you build it out of the IBC, you follow the commercial provisions. And it doesn't follow the parameters that you'll find out of the energy code. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. So with that, let's talk about a few other items. Now, I will tell you that I did design this particular class to allow for any types of questions that comes into this. So feel free at any point to ask the question and allow for us to kind of go through all of that, because I know it's new. Now, one of the things that is incorporated into Chapter 1 is providing us with the information on the construction documents to demonstrate that you meet the parameters or the provisions that you find within the Chapter 3, 4, and 5. And so as you can see on the screen here, the purple here are all of the items that must be portrayed on the plans for if it's a solar ready zone. And you'll also see in pink here all of the parameters that are required to be placed on the plans when we're talking about EV spaces. And then the blue here at the bottom are the provisions that are required to be placed on the plans when we're talking about that electric ready provisions. Now, the one thing I want you to keep in mind is it does say at the very end of the charging state section that details shall include but are not limited to the following as applicable. So you may need to provide more information, or you can ask for more information, because the idea is that whatever's portrayed to you provides significant clarity to demonstrate that what's been designed meets the requirements that we find out of this code. So let's jump into the very first topic, which is our lovely Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 is electric ready. Now, many of you have probably had dealings where you understand the concepts of electric vehicle charging stations and solar ready provisions, because that's been in the code for a while now. But electric ready is a rather new concept. And so I want to talk about what the major differences between some of these items that get talked about, because I know often, people talk about electric ready, and instead of understanding there's various categories of it, they instantly think that everything has to be electric. And that is not necessarily the case for this. So the first kind of like the very, very basic of what the electrification steps would be is the electric ready. And the idea of electric ready is where you're preparing the building that if they're utilizing gas equipment or it's designed to have gas equipment, that they have the opportunity to change out that gas equipment to electric equipment without having to basically do a lot of deconstructive alteration to it. It's basically in place that all they're going to need to do is, add a plug, right? So that's kind of the concept for the electric ready. Everything, the wiring, the conduit, it's all there ready for them. And then all they need to do is add the final touches type of deal. Now, electric preferred, which is a kind of a step up category, this would be probably that medium concept, is where you're going to have all the provisions installed for the electric ready, but then you go a little bit further beyond, where if you're going to install those gas appliances or fuel gas appliances, instead of requiring that they would be the federal minimum efficiency, you would use where it have to be a higher efficiency included with that. So that's kind of that electric preferred. And then the all electric is that no gas infrastructure is being installed. And what you have is your heating and cooling and service water heating is all being taken care of by electric equipment. So those are the three, I would say, basic categories of the concepts of electric. And what we're going to look at is what the state is asking for, which is the electric ready, just the bare minimum, right? Just making sure that we're providing the opportunity that at some point down the road, they can move from that gas equipment to that electric equipment without having to rip out walls and all that fun stuff. So let's kind of dive into what it says. So this is only required if you happen to be a new building, major renovations and additions. It also talks about that you have to add that electric infrastructure, which is what they're requiring at the electric ready components, when you're installing that combustion equipment. Now, there are some exceptions. The exception being your interior fireplaces, as long as the interior fireplace is not going to be used as a primary heat, and exterior fireplaces and fire pits. So I see we have a question. I sent an email today to and received a response from Donnie Featherman with DOLA regarding factory built homes will meet these requirements. He said they will not. They are working on adopting these by 2025, but until then, they do not apply to factory built structures, which honestly, it would be correct, because remember that these provisions are only required if you adopt new codes after July 1st of this year. The state had adopted prior to the deadline, so they are given within the law itself they are given until 2025. So this is one of those that, because it would be a factory manufactured home, you would have to follow what DOLA and the Department of Housing has established for that. But they are they do have some requirements within that House bill, but they're on a different time frame. Stephen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk, Stephen. So you just need to unmute yourself on your side. We're not hearing anything on our end, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind trying to unmute. All right. In the meantime, Hope, why don't we keep going on? And Stephen,
Right.
if you can unmute yourself, great. If not, feel free to write in the chat and we'll answer your question there as well.
Okay. So for the electric ready provisions, I know that, like I said, it's a newer concept. So I'm going to give you what the actual code says, and then I'll give you kind of the bullet point, like what they're trying to require. So it's a little bit more digestible. So basically what 301 said is, if you are you're building a new house, you're doing major renovations, which I believe is defined. And then the additions, if you're putting in an addition, that addition would be required to comply with the electric ready. If I remember correctly, when it's an addition, it's just the addition that would have to do it, as long as you're not changing out that mechanical equipment. How is a major renovation defined? That is an excellent question. So let me, I'm going to pull up the code here, and I'm going to show you, I hope, if it will allow me in here. Sometimes it doesn't allow me in here when I'm have a class going, but let's see if it moves over. Did it move over? Okay, let's see if it worked. Did it? Nope, it didn't. Okay, are you guys able to see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay. So if we go, don't get sick. Let's see if they put in here what major. So they do not have it defined as far as what is considered as a major renovation, which is probably to your advantage. And I think, if I remember, the conversation about it is the fact that there are a lot of jurisdictions that already have a defined definition of what a major renovation is. Some call it, a major alteration. So that may have been why there wasn't a definition expressed. So it becomes now, in my opinion, and this is my opinion on it, as far as major renovations, that might be more of a jurisdictional interpretation of it. If they're renovating the whole house, then it would make sense. If it's a 800 square foot house and they're renovating the bedroom that's 400 square feet, that might make sense, type of deal. So I think this one could really be left up to each jurisdiction's interpretation for it. I hope that helps, Rebecca. It's not a concrete answer, but it might be the best that we can get right now. So Crystal, I'm not sure from where, has defined it. Oh, Gunnison, as a level 3 alteration, which is, quite honestly, is fairly common. A lot of jurisdictions that have particular items tied to a major renovation, whether new items kick in, they do use that level 3 alteration concept out of the IECC or IEBC. So not uncommon. Great to know, Crystal. So one of the things that we have to think about, again, is we got to have space in that electrical panel. So it says that you have to have a reserved space for a minimum of a 2-pole circuit breaker for each branch circuit provided for future electric equipment. So, or appliance. And it's not saying that you just have to have one spot. If you have, I don't know, 14 different gas equipment and appliances, then you would have to have 14 spaces reserved for it. So keep that in mind. But it is basically saying for whichever, or I should say whatever is on a branch circuit. And this is not all that uncommon. We know anytime there's anything placed into that electrical panel, it's gotta be labeled. And the same thing can be said when we're talking about the electric ready, right? So the junction box or receptacle, and also the dedicated circuit breaker space, and I'll learn how to speak English sometimes too, serving future electric equipment or appliances in the electrical panel shall be labeled for the intended use. So you are going to have to place it in the panel, but it's not just the panel. You will have to take, that conduit. If it's, in a conduit, it'll, say for electric equipment or the junction box or the receptacle, whatever is getting installed there also has to say for future equipment use. So it's not just the panel that you are going to have to label, it's the other equipment or material, I guess, for lack of a great word here, that's associated with that too. So junction box, receptacle. There also has to be an understanding that receptacle and junction box, that there is a distance requirements, right? So you can't have that receptacle installed, 14 feet away or on the other side of the house for it. It's got to make sense that it's basically you're removing this equipment, taking it out, and that you should be able to like plug and play, like I was mentioning. So what this is telling us is that a receptacle has to be provided within 3 feet of the combustion equipment or appliance, or within 3 feet of that dedicated space. Now, there is an exception to this, and it does talk about that you can have up to 6 feet. And the 6 feet is, well, let me put it this way. The receptacle or junction box has to be within 3 feet of that combustion equipment if it is a non-HVAC equipment. So if you have a gas stove, then you're going to need to make sure that there's a plug or junction box within 3 feet of that appliance. So basically when the gas is removed, that they can put that electric cooktop in, and the plug doesn't have to go 20 feet type of deal. Now, it's also saying that for the HVAC equipment, right, your heating, your cooling, service water heating, that you have the opportunity that receptacle can be within 6 feet of where the combustion equipment is. So it gives you a little bit of a longer distance, understanding that you need to have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to your HVAC equipment, as opposed to you're swapping out a gas stovetop or a cooktop for an electric cooktop. Now, because we're talking about combustion equipment, they did state that you also have to have a condensate drain. Now, it is.
Hey, Hope.
Yes.
Before we move on, I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Are you required to have the utility provider supply upgraded service, for example, from 125 amps to 200 amps?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's not so much that you are required um, to have that. What you are required to do is make sure that what your electrical panel is going to be adequate for the the equipment that could be going in. I know it's really tough, and when we start talking about all these components that are coming into play here, chances are your panel will probably be upsized to, you know, a larger panel. You probably are looking at 300 amp panels. So in this particular instance, it's not required that you kind of do the calculations for it, but it is something to keep in mind. All right, so in discussing, I don't know if the condensate drain, you do have to provide a condensate drain. It's very, very basic, just saying, hey, by the way, you got to have it. Because they understand that the IPC and the IMC and the IRC, kind of depending which one, you know, the provisions are coming from, are really going to dictate when and where you have that condensate drain. So they're kind of handing it over to the other codes to address, but it's kind of a don't forget, you know, we got to have that condensate drain. And then when we're talking about for the required inspections, because just as I mentioned earlier, you know, there are very specific items that are being called out, need to be placed on the plans. There's going to be very specific inspections that are going to need to be looked at. And as you can see on the screen, what you're looking at is going to be additional inspections that the electrical inspector is going to want to verify, which is going to be, you know, the branch circuits, conduits, raceways, junction box receptacles that, you know, they have the labeling, that they're installed in the correct location as to what the plans say, make sure that the panel has the reserved spaces for that equipment and appliances. Now, number 3 does say that the electrical capacity and reserved physical space for the circuit breaker and the panel are properly labeled. So that is an important aspect of it. And then, of course, the final, right? Making sure that all that stuff is within working order. It's very vague as far as what the final inspection is, because each thing is going to be have a different requirements as far as what a final would be. So that is all of the electric ready provisions that you're going to find. Does anybody have any questions concerning that they would like to ask? All right, well then we will move on to solar ready. Now, as you can imagine, the solar ready provisions will probably look very familiar. In the energy code and actually out of the IRC also, there has been an appendix for solar ready provisions for several cycles now. Now, the Colorado Energy Code Board did take a look at what those, what the appendix did have to offer. And the provisions that you'll see as we walk through this probably will look very familiar, because while it's not exactly, because it was kind of geared towards what Colorado sees and is involved with, the concepts are very, very similar. And there's just a few tweaks here and there that were included with it. So this should feel very familiar to people. So again, for this requirement, they are requiring that it goes for new buildings, major renovations, and additions. So if you're a new building and addition, I think that's pretty straightforward. As we mentioned before, major major renovations may be something that will have to be more addressed about. So it is requiring that if you have a building that has at least 600 square feet of roof area, you will be required to fall under these provisions. So there are a few exceptions on this that says you do not have to have a solar ready zone if you're already installing a permanently on-site renewable energy system that's going to provide you with your electricity for that particular dwelling unit. Makes sense, right? Why are we going to save space on the roof if we're already using the space on the roof to collect the solar? So they wanted to make sure to acknowledge that. And then the other thing to acknowledge is sometimes you just don't have the solar sun that is within access to your building, right? You got a big building here, you got a big building here, and a teeny tiny building down here. This little teeny tiny building may not have, you know, the ability that sun is actually going to hit it. And so if you are in that type of a situation, they may allow for this exception to come into play. Now, it's not just buildings. Maybe you have your building in a location that has 200-year-old trees that are enormous, and that's part of the charm of the area. You can't remove them. So that may be an instance where it may be permitted that it could be exempt from it. But it's the shading. If there is, you know, a significant amount of shading on that building, then you're going to be exempt from that. Oops. Maybe if I can get it to work. There we go. Okay, so it is talking about that you have to have your solar ready zone has to have 300 square feet basically designated as your solar ready zone. Now that's for if you're a single family or, you know, 2-family home. If you are a townhouse, then they're saying that the 300 square feet of solar ready zone can be reduced down to that 150 square feet. And the reasoning for that is because sometimes each individual unit is not going to be as have the space that a you know, that a single family home may have as far as their roof area for that. It does talk about that 300 square feet is it does not incorporate all of the mandatory requirements, right? Because there are some mandatory access or setback requirements, you know, that you might find within the IFC. And you can't have less than 80 square feet of access or setback areas in some of those applications. Now, the other thing is when we're talking about that solar ready zone, the concept of it is, like I said, you know, we're trying to have it prepared for the future of the solar panels to be able to go in. And so because of that, we have to make sure that the designated areas that have been placed on those plans, right? Because that's a requirement out of 103.2 in here, is that you have to have that designated area on the roof, and that designated area of the roof cannot have any obstructions. Now, that is going to, I think this is probably, out of everything, is probably going to be one of those newest types of concept as far as what do we do? Because in the past, what have we done, right? Have we cared what goes through the roof? Probably not for the most part, right? I mean, we do have requirements, but they can go through the roof and there's nothing prohibiting necessarily where it could be. But now we actually have to think about it because the obstructions there's a lot of forethought that's going to need to happen with this. Now, as you can see, it talks about a few things that you have to be aware of. And residentially, I think we need to, or what we're going to be looking for is more along the lines of vents, right? We got vents. If that happens to be a vented attic, we know that there are very specific requirements as far as how much venting is going to be placed in the upper level or in the lower level of the roof, depending on, is it 130 or is it 150 ventilation rates that we're using, right? So that's going to make a huge difference. And that also is part of that real estate that's up on that roof, because we can't get away from the vents for the roof vent, attic venting, if we have a vented attic, or it's going to require that we change the design and make it an unvented attic and follow those requirements. So it's going to take a little bit more planning as far as, you know, things that we got to think about, and making sure all of the people can play in the sandbox. Because it's also, we have to think about, you know, pipes and ductwork too, right? Because we have plumbing vents that are coming up through the roof. We also have some of our HVAC equipment. Some of those vents are coming up through the roof, and all of those exhausts, we'll say exhausts for this matter, all of that cannot be placed where it's been designated as a solar ready zone. So in the past, again, right, the plumber takes a look and says, okay, so if we do this, that is the straightest route, or the, you know, closest route to exhaust this out of the roof, right? And so now there's going to have to be that communication. No, you're going to have to take it over another 10 feet because this space is dedicated for that solar ready zone. So pipes, ducts, all of that is going to have to take into consideration. The other thing is skylights too, right? Skylights are going to have to be thought of as far as, you know, making sure that if we're designing and placing those skylights within the roof itself, that they're not being located or, you know, having issues with where the potential solar panels would go to. So when we start looking at all that, right, we also think about those solar panels. So I have this on the screen because we're going to pretend like this is our, you know, solar ready zone. So where those panels are, we shouldn't see any vents, we shouldn't see any pipes, we shouldn't see any skylights there. And that's kind of the concept that we want to make sure that we have going on within our designs of these particular structures. That one, like I said, I think that's the one that's going to be the most you know, thinking of that you'll have to think about too. The other thing is shading. Like I mentioned before, we have to keep in mind there's going to be times that, you know, shading, we have to think about where we are placing these on the roof, or potentially placing these on the roof. Are we placing it on, you know, having that solar ready zone designated in a spot that has all these trees, that if you had put it onto the other portion of the roof, it would have great access to the sun. So then we have to think about where we are placing these items. And probably the most important is thinking about that roof load design. We need to make sure that that roof load design has been indicated on the plans, and it calls it out here, specifically making sure that the dead load and the live load incorporates the solar panels being installed on it. Because there's nothing worse, you go through all this and the structural engineer, or whoever did the engineering for the roof, did not take into account that there were going to be panels placed on there. And the whole idea is that they don't have to go in and adjust their structural components. They could just place the panels on their roof. Now, the other thing, a couple of things is you got to have that interconnection pathway, the construction document, documentation certificate that should be on the panel or, you know, within a location. Obviously, the electrical panel probably really doesn't have a whole lot of room to be placing this, but it does need to be near that panel, or the water heater or someplace conspicuous. And it needs to, you know, indicate that there are solar ready zones indicated, and so that it's perfectly ready there. So as you can see on the screen, here's an example. It says, you know, about including a metal raceway. Oh, and I don't have the picture. I have the picture of it actually showing it on it says future photovoltaic. So it had oh, they had the conduit all ready to go. So again, we're reserving more space within that panel. It's got to have at least a dual pole circuit breaker for it. And it also has the location of where it needs to be, which is at the opposite end of where the input feeder is located, or the main circuit location is, which is probably very important. And so again, it does talk about for the capacity of it, and I don't know why that's on there, but here's an example, and I don't know if you can see it, but here we go. It says future photovoltaic. And then I put the one with the panel with the lid closed. Because, hey, why would I want to show you what it actually looks like? But this is in an area that they've required solar ready for a couple of cycles now. So that was the solar ready zone. And now we're gonna take a quick jaunt into the electric ready, or electric vehicle ready concept with this. And so when we're talking about electric ready, it says again that if you are a new home, a major renovation, or you're an addition, that you would need to comply with the electric vehicle ready. Now, I've had a couple of questions that have come in that I will admit I do not have the answer for, and that may be something to reach out to the state about, is when they, what I'm getting asked about is when it talks about addition and in installing that electric ready vehicle, are they talking about installing, or it's an addition that's a garage where an electric vehicle would be, or that a vehicle could reside in. So that's something that we may need to talk about. It does talk about too in 502 that new vehicle parking spaces for residential buildings shall be provided in accordance with section 5021 and 5023. So one is if you are a single and two family dwelling and townhouses, each dwelling unit with a dedicated attached or detached garage or other on-site designated parking provided for the dwelling unit must be provided with an EV ready space per that dwelling unit. So what this section is saying, it probably makes a lot of sense. You're a single family, you've got a garage or some parking space, you're going to install the electric ready or electric vehicle ready. If you're two family, then you're installing two. If you're a townhouse that has 6 units, then those you're going to need to provide 6 EV charging infrastructure for those 6 units, whether it's a attached garage, a detached garage, or you have on-site designated parking for those 6 townhouses. You're going to have EV charging for all of those. So I hope that makes sense and it's not as cumbersome as you think. So when we talk about the EV ready space, it's got to have a branch circuit, and that branch circuit needs to comply with all three of the items that we see listed there. It has to terminate at a receptacle, and it has to be located within 3 feet of what each EV ready space is. So that's probably very, very easy if it's a garage of a single family or a garage of the 2-family idea. And the townhouses, right? So townhouses, this one might be not as straightforward, but it's very, I think, incredibly doable, and it just takes a little bit of planning for that. You've got to have a circuit capacity, a minimum circuit capacity of the 8.3 kVAs. And you also have to have that electrical panel, and it's the electrical distribution equipment directory, and all outlets or enclosures have to be marked for that future electric vehicle supply equipment, right? So we need to know that, hey, this plug is not going for the electric ready. This plug is for a future car charger. So we have to label what each of these potential plugs or junction boxes are being utilized for, or what they were designed and intended for. So that is some of the panel or the markings. And again, like we saw, the raceways, we saw the conduit, and it had the little note that I realized looking at the screen is really hard to say, where it said future photovoltaic. It would say something like future electric vehicle charging. So those are the requirements. Now there's an exception, like if you already install the actual charger itself, then you don't have to, have the ready space. It's considered good at that point. You do have to identify things within the construction documents, designating where the EV ready space is, the locations of path, raceways, conduits, termination points, all of that. It says it here. It also says it in 103. So they're making sure that, hey, by the way, all of this needs to be placed on there. If you were wondering, we do want to see it on the plans. I know that was a discussion in one of the meetings, was making sure that there's an understanding that this information also has to be placed on the construction documents. And part of that is because, thinking about it, sometimes the electric vehicle, even with this, would be looked at with planning as far as it, is it in the right location and so forth, but also making sure that the information that's needed for the building department also has that information. Are conductors required to be installed between the panel and receptacle location? I don't believe on this one that it is requiring that, because if we go, it says, remember, 5021 through 5023, it does say, in the bottom, it does talk about conduit and raceways. Are conductors required to be installed? You know what? That's a great question. I think that would be a good one to verify with the energy board as to what the intent was for that. So I know that Ted put the explanatory notes in there. You can go on to that website that Erica had put in there. And like I said, it gives you 3 options. You can look what the actual verbiage is. It also has the user notes, and then a 3rd option of what to look at on there. And it might have it in there, and I apologize. For the life of me, I cannot remember if that would be required. So with all of that I had mentioned as far as what the requirements are, this was a set of plans that were submitted. and I'm not saying good, bad, or ugly, with the requirements that you see on here, says identifying on the plans, it says provide an electrical car charger rough-in, including a blanked electrical box and raceway terminating in the electrical panel. So my question for everybody here is this one little note sufficient in demonstrating that they're providing the EV ready requirements? And I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you would say they meet the intent of what the language for EV EV ready was asking for? Okay. Go ahead and lower your hand, Randy. How many of you say no, raise your hand, that you don't feel that they provided the correct information for you or enough information per what was listed with what we discussed? Okay, we have quite a few hands up. All right. Well, at least I know not all of you have fallen asleep with me talking today. So if you took what was on here and we looked at this portion, this was the notes. This is the garage plan that shows us receptacles and so forth. Do you, all those that had your hand up saying no, does what you see on the screen change your mind? Anybody change their mind? I know I'm asking you to look at something really quick, but what I'll tell you is there's no information in here about the EV charging that we saw here. It also doesn't provide us the information about where it's going to be located. And that is a requirement out of 103.2. It says you need to place where it's going to be in there. So with this and this, I would not consider that it meets the intent of what they're asking for there. Now, here's an example. It's really simple, right? This is in the process. This is going to be where their electric vehicle charger is going to be located in the garage there. In Colorado, it's a location in Colorado. They've been requiring it for a while. So if we're talking about what the required inspections would be, when we're talking about for EV ready, it does talk about the power transfer infrastructure, whatever that electrical equipment that's associated with it, branch circuits, raceways, junction boxes, receptacles, making sure that there's electrical capacity and that the correct reserved physical space has been observed in the panel. And that all of the labeling for all of those components have been labeled. And then obviously at the very end, we'll be looking upon this. Now, what I'm going to tell you is you probably looked at these and thought some of it, all of the required inspections that I've shown you today kind of look like a little bit of, they're kind of, maybe you think that they're geared towards maybe commercial. And what I can tell you is the required inspections are not broken out by residential and commercial. So there may be some components that you see within each of these lists that are not maybe pertaining to residential, and they may be more commercial. But remember, for this aspect of it, the inspections is kind of a one size fits all, whether it's residential or commercial. So I hope everybody had a lot of fun talking about EV ready and electric ready and solar ready provisions. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're all trying to kind of navigate exactly how the verbiage will play out in the everyday life of this. So if you have questions, reach out to me, reach out to Erica, reach out to Adam Berry with the Colorado Energy Office. Probably would make a really good question to submit through the helpline. That would be my suggestion.
Agreed, Hope.
So that's all I got, folks.
Thanks again, Hope, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.